And if anyone can remember, at the end of class on Monday or Wednesday, sorry, I asked you guys to think about what are nucleic acids responsible for, to sort of begin thinking about what their main role in the body is. These are the group of biomolecules that are not often talked about, the way that we commonly speak about carbohydrates, proteins, fats in our everyday, communication, because they're in our diet, really. Nucleic acids, we don't really speak about them on an everyday basis, but they have some really important roles. Did anyone want to share any of that? What are the main roles of nucleic acids? What do they do in the body? And while we think about that, we can go ahead and summarize the main role of the other biomolecules. So we talked about carbohydrates. They are the main source of energy, especially energy storage, especially glycogen. This is how our body puts energy away into the muscles, into the liver, into the kidneys that can be used at a later time. The proteins are going to be really important for our muscle, but also for lots of other things. Hormones, enzymes, transporters, all of these things are proteins, and they can be modulated in different ways. Enzymes are proteins, which we're going to speak about coming up. And so proteins have a whole different variety of functions, but mainly we think about them as building for muscle. And then fats we know are important also for energy storage, but mainly for transport of molecules as well. And then fats are really important as far as their caloric, their energy storage as well, right? We can put energy storage into the fat deposits in the body as a storage form as well. Okay, I don't see any responses. Oh, here we go. So nucleic acids can store and express genetic code. Awesome. Thank you for raising that. So that's a really good place to start. When we think about nucleic acids, they're the building blocks of our DNA. This is our genetic material. So this is how we can store, as you said correctly, and express our genetic material. And so when you think about the structure of nucleic acids, they can be DNA or RNA, which really is a very slight molecular difference. And so we start out with a phosphate group here on the left. So here's our phosphate group. Bound to that covalently is a carbohydrate ring, which is in the center here. And this carbohydrate ring can look very differently depending on whether it's a DNA or an RNA nucleic acid. Another great response is that it's a massive energy potential, so to store massive energy potential in the form of ATP. Wonderful. So that is the second major function of nucleic acids that we're going to speak about. We'll talk about ATP several times throughout this semester in every single chapter probably, because ATP is the most abundant energy storage form in our body as far as the molecule. And so ATP is the way that we can use to transfer that energy as well, okay? So really great points. So the carbohydrate ring in the middle here is really what will determine whether this is DNA, which is a deoxyribose nucleic acid, or RNA, which is a ribose nucleic acid. And so whether it has a single H or an OH is that very slight difference between deoxyribose and ribose. The other important component here is the the nitrogenous base at the end here in green. And this again will determine whether this is a purine, which typically has 2 rings, or a pyrimidine, which will typically have a single ring. And so the different types of pyrimidines are cytosine, if it had this nitrogenous base attached, thymine, if it had this nitrogenous base here, and then uracil at the end. The purines would be adenine, again, 2 rings, and then guanine, also 2 rings. So there are different types of nucleic acids, and you'll see these as repeating units. If you look at a piece of DNA, a code of DNA, it can be A, C, or CG, depending on exactly what type of nucleic acid. Okay, so the main takeaway here is that the building blocks for our genetic material, the way that we express every single feature of our body, right, our phenotype especially, is coded within that genetic material. The other point here, which we just got into, let's see. Do we need to know the structure of the organic molecules? You don't need to know the structure. That's not something that I will ask you to memorize. I do expect you to know the difference between the single wing purines. Let me start again. The single wing pyrimidines and the double wing purines. I do expect you to also know that there are 5 types of nucleic acids. And which ones are purines and pyrimidines, okay? Yeah, but I don't expect you to memorize this necessarily. Good question. So the other main function of nucleic acids is for transferring of energy. So adenosine, triphosphate, diphosphate, monophosphate is a really important molecule that helps us to move our energy around. One of the main laws of thermodynamics is that energy is never created from scratch, right? It's always transferred from one form to the other. And so ATP is one of the main forms of that energy transfer. We will speak about the cellular respiration, we will speak about the electron transport chain and how we actually make this ATP. But the main point is that ATP is only made to keep that energy in one form. I like to compare it to a backup battery. You charge that backup battery so that you can have it if you're out and about and you don't have access to energy. So it's a way to store that energy temporarily so that it can only be used later on. The format or the composition of AMP is adenosine. And adenosine is really adenine plus a ribose. So we've got adenosine, and then we can add 1, 2, or 3 phosphates. If it's 1 phosphate, it's AMP, monophosphate. If it's 2 phosphates on there, it's diphosphate or ADP. And then if it's 3 phosphates, it's triphosphate or ATP. So we will speak quite frequently about the transference from ADP to ATP, how we can store energy in that last phosphate and go from ADP, add that phosphate on to make ATP, which has that energy being stored, and how we can cleave that phosphate, release that off, and then liberate that energy to do lots of things in the body. The other 2 nucleic acids that help with energy transfer are NAD, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. Sorry, I butchered that. Nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, NAD, and then flavin adenine dinucleotide, FAD, are 2 other energy transfer molecules as well. These are involved in oxidation and reduction reactions. And the main energy that these 2 molecules transfer are electrons, right? Electrons. So we could think about, again, that electron transport chain, the electrons that are brought into the mitochondria to help create the gradient that drives that electron transport chain are done so by these 2 molecules. So in their reduced form, they are going to be NADH plus carrying that electron. In their oxidized form, they're going to just be NAD, having no electrons. So again, we will speak about this in cellular respiration, how we use these 2 molecules to shuttle electrons into different locations in the cell that are going to help with different types of reactions. Okay. Now we do have the cyclical form of nucleotides. These are called cyclic AMP and cyclic GMP. And these guys, simply based on the different molecular structure, the fact that the adenosine here is in a ring, that small molecular difference means that these 2 molecules do a completely different job in the cell. And so cyclic AMP, cyclic GMP are going to help send signals in the cell. They're going to be messengers, if you will. Another example that we'll look at when we talk about some of the neurotransmitters is how they encourage the levels of cyclic AMP and cyclic GMP in the cell to change. So for example, if we increase the level of cyclic AMP, that can result in blood vessels constricted. right? So the way that we can send different signals and messages in the cell to different organelles, from the membrane to the mitochondria to the nucleus, is basically based upon the levels of cyclic AMP and cyclic GMP. All right, so they can be our messengers within the cell.